So easily some of the most viewed and asked about questions, and definitely in my boat also, is on electronics. People know that they don't know everything they need to know. And we've put out several of these videos, but me and producer dude felt like we needed another one because everybody's just not really getting it. So we're gonna give you as broke down as possibly can be on these things. But what you need to understand is, please don't ask us what are your settings. It has nothing to do with your settings. What it is its identification, so you know what to look for. That's a big one. But the other thing is the transducer. And each and every boat is going to be different. So we're going to point out some things that you can look for, strakes, rivet lines, different things that will cause you to have a bad situation. So no setting is really going to make a huge difference. Most of these default settings with the majority of the manufacturers are really dialed in so that you have good stuff right out of the gate. You can tweak it a little bit, but improper transducer location, setup, angle, all that good stuff is actually the deal that we're going to show you, because that's what makes or breaks marking at speed. So when marking at speed, we get a lot of questions, and we almost kind of joke about it with, the setups or the buttons that you need to have. Mostly with these, you're going to set them on auto and you're pretty much good. Now, one thing you don't want to do and you want to adjust, even if you're in the same exact, let's say, rock pile from spring to fall or even Monday to Tuesday as water clarity changes and things, is changing your sensitivity or power just a little bit. And I'm going to show you a really good way to do that. And you can also a good way to check to make sure your transducer is not damaged, because hitting them with things will break the crystals free, will cause it to not perform properly. And that's simply just going to, so we're in about 35 feet of water right here. So what I want to do is that I want to more than double my bottom depth range. Now you can see I just barely have my secondary return. And so I'm going to want to put a little more power to that. And then I want to see a secondary return, because if I don't have enough power, you can see even that little bait fish or fish went away. But by doing this and putting it up there, so I just see that secondary return, now we can see something that's small is small. So we're not trying to make an elephant look like an ant or an ant look like an elephant. So adjust your sensitivity, your power to the conditions that you're in, more than doubling your bottom depth range, and then going back to what you want so you get to maximize your screen size. And that's all there is to it. That's one setting that'll definitely make a difference when you're trying to mark at speed. What we've got up towards the top is bait. When you start seeing long, kind of stretched out marks, that's generally going to be bait fish almost all of the time. And then on the bottom we see some bait balls, probably a little bit smaller bait, but a lot more of it. These little streaks that you see in the center there are where I was going with the waves, and that actually is, the transducer kind of just breaking seal a little bit. These little tiny hooks that you see kind of in between there are fairly small walleyes in the center portion of the column. You also kind of notice that those are away from the bait. That generally is actually the case of where we're catching those fish. In this screen here, you can see it was probably pretty rough that day. This is actually just surface disturbance breaking, where we're going to have some bubbles and things, the transducer kind of popping out of the water a little bit, just kind of breaking the seal. And these little tiny hooks that we've got together here are actually, if you would visualize a arch going much slower. So at 16 miles an hour, we're starting to see kind of a little bit of an arch, where those are going to look a lot more like a BB when we're going more than, let's say, 20 miles an hour. But we can see we've got fish, from the bottom all the way up to about 15 feet deep, and we're looking for the color. The little yellow in there is what we want to see. We don't want to see a lighter return. That yellow is going to signify a stronger return, so we know that that is probably a walleye or a larger game fish. Here on this picture, we basically have some fish being marked at 25 miles an hour, and they're spread kind of throughout the column. These are a little bit smaller fish, but you can really, if you look close, you can see that we've got some yellow in there. And I had the sensitivity a little bit higher because we had a little bit more of off-colored water, and so that was picking up some of that kind of sediment and such, but we wanted to make sure that we picked up all of these fish on here, because as you can see, we had them from even a few around the 12-foot mark all the way throughout the column down to near the bottom in 30-some feet, so spread out there. But this is why it's really important, and I like the palette, which is yellow, as the strongest return, because then we can see these fish here, even though we have a little bit of disturbance on the screen. On the left side of the screen, we have where we were going approximately pushing 30 miles an hour. You can see how tiny these arches are here together, nice and really tight, because we're going so quickly. And as we start to slow down, where the disturbance goes away and that boat comes off pad, you can see those arches start to get bigger, and marks like this right here are the same type as they are here. We're just going much, much slower.
And then when we're completely off pad and basically idling here at 1.5 miles an hour, kind of at trolling speed, you can see how those marks, how they look much bigger because they're in the cone for a much longer period of time and we're not going through so quickly. You know, when you see a screen like this, we've got fish all the way in 30-some feet of water here, these tiny little hooks, all the way up to approximately about 11 feet down. And the thing to really key, a lot of people maybe would put a lot of baits down, and while I would still spread them out, you notice a majority of these fish are 21 feet and above, and this cone towards the top is much, much smaller. So even if we see 1 or 2 fish here, that's generally going to mean we have a lot more. So 1 or 2 down here is probably equal to like 10 up here. So a lot more fish because of a much smaller cone diameter towards the top. Here's a really good example of several things. We've got a lot of bait towards the bottom here on the left side of the screen. I'm guessing most of those are probably gizzard shad or some type of fairly decent size minnow. And you can notice we're just idling over those at that point. Now, towards the right side of the screen, if you look at, we're going 31 miles an hour here, and you see the disturbance because we've got air bubbles and things going on because we're going quite quickly. But then we also notice down at the bottom, we've got another little bait ball here, and you see how those kind of go vertical, and you're not going to have them strung out because they're going through the screen so quickly. So it's going to be a whole different look on things, even though it's the exact same scenario. There's the difference being idle speed versus almost 32 miles an hour. So you notice we have a lot of things going on the screen here. On the upper left, we've got some kind of really light blue little marks. A lot of people think those are fish, and while they're definitely something, it's nothing we're going to catch. I always like to say no color, no good. And so especially that high where the signal strength is going to be stronger, you know, that's not something that we're going to target or kind of worry about. As we get down towards the middle portion of the water column, you're going to see some of those with yellow in the center. That's a stronger return. Those are fish that are definitely catchable. But the other thing I really like to look for, and I call them basically tails, you see right here on the end of this long fish. We don't care about the length of it because that means it's just staying in the cone longer. But when we see these little distinct tails, that means we're marking that fish on the extreme outer side of the cone. So that's going to tell us that that's a bigger fish. The length of it is not going to tell us that, but still being able to mark that on the extreme outer edge of the cone means bigger fish for sure. Here's yet another example of some fish being marked at high speed. This is almost kind of the ultimate thing, gets you excited. See, because we've got fish here from about maybe 16 feet or so all the way down towards the bottom. A lot of marks on the bottom and very close to that, and I'm sure most of the fish actually on the bottom we're not seeing at the speed of 25 miles an hour. But you notice all these hooks here between like 27 and 40, there's a lot of fish going on there. And that's allowing us to cover a lot of water and see those. But if we had, not clean power, if we didn't have our sensitivity, set properly, we're not going to have a clean screen to be able to see all of these because they're not marking huge and probably skedaddling from the boat a little bit. But at 25 miles an hour, we're still getting a shot to look at them.
So picking the right transducer location is huge. You want to make sure that you don't have anywhere near a chine, rivets for example, rotation of the prop, kicker, basically anything that's going to create air bubbles, because the transducer beam does not go through air, hence the air bubbles, but it does go through water. So picking a clean area that's not going to have air bubbles is the #1 challenge. The next thing you can do is, because you may not know, even if you drive your boat differently, it's going to be maybe different than how mine is and where we have other things located, drains, high-speed pickups, all those things are going to change a little bit from one boat to another. So simply putting a transducer board like this Berth Custom Tackle transducer board on will allow you to move that transducer around to many different locations, but you only have one hole in the boat, and the sacrificial deal will actually be the transducer board itself. So one thing that I've noticed is I run 2 transducers for my boat primarily. I run my side imaging, and you can see how large that is to have the mega side imaging and down imaging. It's a much larger transducer. So I prefer to have that up and out of the way for not making more bubbles for my 2D, which I'll show you in a second. But the other thing is this will actually be out of the water when we're running, so there's much less chance of damaging it, and they are very expensive. You actually want this angled up because I want that flat while I'm at the speed I'm going to be using it at, which primarily for me is 2 to 5 miles an hour. So having that angle up and out of the way, having the transducer board so I can have that sacrificial deal if I need to move that around to get it just right, it's going to save you putting a lot of holes in. And then we get down to the bottom down here, which is kind of hard to see, but that's my money maker. It's a very simple, just dual frequency. It's the chirp, but it's a simple 2D transducer. And I've got this down as low as I can get it as far as on the boat, but I want it about where, just halfway between the transducer and the bottom of the boat there. The key with these, especially when you do it the first time, definitely put a transducer board down there, because getting just the right angle and height is going to take several adjustments and incremental. I've seen your comments where you say, I've moved it twice, I've moved it 3 times, that's not it. You may have to move it 100 times if you don't do it. Incrementally, it's kind of like tuning a crankbait. So the angle and the height is super important, as well as the location. I prefer mine on the left side of the drain plug, but you know, depending on what you have down here, if you have high-speed pickups, that's going to kill that. You know, just look for an area that doesn't have the bubbles and get it as low as you can as far as on your hull, where you're not having it actually create bubbles. Another factor in having the ability to mark at high speed is having a clean screen. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to have a completely separate battery for your electronics. That's also going to help so you don't overstress your house battery, especially if you're using multiple larger screen units. And for that, I've got the Dakota Lithium 135 dual purpose, which is nice because you can jumpstart your cranking battery off of that, where a traditional non-dual purpose battery you cannot. But then you can also see I've got a distribution panel and a shutoff switch, so we don't have any power draw at any time when we don't want to have it, when we're not using those. The other thing is all of the wire that's going directly from the units to that distribution panel is 10 gauged tinned copper heat shrink connections, really heavy wire. If you're going a longer distance, you may even need heavier, so you don't have ampage drop and you get really clean power that when you turn your unit on, it's not going to flash. So marking at speed is an incredibly good way to break down water quickly and eliminate just dead water. Most days it's the difference between catching and not catching. And while it can be really overwhelming to kind of figure that out, really just hopefully these tips show you that there are micro details, and identifying the fish and knowing what to look for, it's not difficult. It's just knowing what to look for. And on the transducer, you may have to move it 5, 6, 7 times, maybe 20 times to get it right. So use a transducer board, and make sure you only put holes in your boat one time and use that sacrificial board. Marking at speed, it's going to catch you a lot more fish. If you want more of this, make sure you book us for an educational trip. We do a lot of these and teach guys firsthand. It's even easier to learn.